I'm Jim Schaefer, the host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. Our guest today is James Duderstadt, who's extremely well known as the President Emeritus of the University of Michigan. He's written two thoughtful and reflective books, University for the 21st Century and Intercollegiate Athletics and the American University, a University President's Perspective. Welcome to Rip Rap, President.
Well, it's my pleasure.
It's a distinct honor to have you on our program, which we're proud to say is the only one in the United States to focus solely on academic books. I must also say that both of your books proved to be fascinating explorations of the world of the contemporary form of the university, both now and for the future. Despite your modest disclaimer in the preface of the university in the 21st century, I found that your book raised so many provocative issues that I began to wish we had the time and resources to do something like a series of 20 hour-long programs. But we must begin somewhere, so I thought perhaps we could get you to reflect on all the ways you define large research centers like the university here. As I read the book, I found references to the research university, entrepreneurial universities, universities as intelligent enterprises, and as part of academic capitalism, and of the post-secondary knowledge industry.
That's right. I think that's part of it. Universities are seen in quite different ways by the different kind of constituencies they relate to. Students see them as an opportunity for an education and perhaps that magic of a diploma to get the next job. Alumni have a nostalgic view of them. The federal government sees them as institutions that not only perform research but provide health care. Politicians and local business see them as economic engines. There are all of these and many more things. I should also point out, because of the second book you mentioned, that many people in the public see this as just another source of commercial entertainment through college football and basketball.
Something else to watch on television.
That's right.
Sunday
That's right.
afternoons.
Exactly.
Yeah. But also, each one of these constituencies has its unique demands, like you said, and I'd like to go in some depth with how they do that and what the implications are.
Certainly. I mean, universities are social institutions, and they're created by society to serve society. And as the needs of society change, universities are transformed in turn. I think one of the points I was trying to make in my book is that rarely do universities change through internal action or conscious thought. They generally change through their interaction with a change in society. It could be the returning of the veterans from the Second World War, for example, which exploded the populations on our campuses, or the needs of the federal government for research results, which created the research university that we know it. These external forces generally can be attributed to a changing society, and in a changing world today, those forces are beginning to build and could change our universities once again.
Well, I think it's also important to point out that of the, I think you point out 3,600 institutions of higher learning, there is a spectrum. There are smaller ones and medium ones and large ones like the University of Michigan, but they all are attempting to now reflect the contemporary pressures that they face in terms of the students and the society.
They do, but in quite different ways. Obviously, one of the characteristics of American higher education is it's extremely diverse, and it ranges from gigantic public universities like the University of Michigan or University of California with tens of thousands of students that try to do everything, to small liberal arts colleges, to community colleges, to increasingly for-profit institutions like the University of Phoenix or even cyberspace universities, which are beginning to evolve. I think that although there are forces that drive universities to look more and more like one another, I think the needs of a diverse society actually are beginning to pull them further and further apart. And I think part of the challenge to contemporary university is to figure out, first of all, to realize it can't be all things to all people, and therefore to determine what it really should be, what its particular unique mission and role is, and then try to focus more on that.
What I thought was interesting is the pressures on the university presidents have increased too, and in your books, you both you talk about Anne as your wife as your first lady, and I think that that's part of the scene now, is that it's become the families of the university presidents get drawn into the pressures along with that.
I think that's true. You know, particularly in a university town like Ann Arbor or Madison or Austin or Chapel Hill, the president and spouse, it's very similar to the President of the United States and the First Lady. In other words, you're not only in terms of authority and role, but in terms of almost spirit, the focal point for the broader community. So in Ann Arbor, we lived in a White House, surrounded by thousands of students, just like the President of the United States lives in a White House, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of people walking back and forth. And many of those symbolic roles are just as important as the actual decisions that the presidents make and so forth. You're expected to kind of show the flag at athletic events, to be present at all ceremonial occasions if the head of state should visit the community or something. One of my colleagues one time said the definition of the modern university president is someone that lives in a large house and begs for a living. And I spent a lot of my time begging because these universities depend very much on private donations of one kind or another. And so both my wife and I entertained, it seemed, almost every night trying to raise more money for the university. But then beyond that, a university presidency is an interesting position because there's a mismatch between responsibility and authority. The responsibilities are immense because anything that happens on the campus, any perception of the university generally ends up on the desk of the president. But unlike many other areas of society, President of the United States, corporate CEO, you generally don't have the authority commensurate with your responsibility. So if you don't watch it, you can fall into a reactive mode, reacting to this crisis or trying to respond to that opportunity, rather than trying to think, well, where should the university head and how do we build support for that direction?
And part of of course, significant constituencies there, at least the directions with the board.
That's right, very much.
The
very
regents
much.
and.
Well, it's the case, and here's a significant difference between public universities, such as the University of Michigan, and private universities, such as Harvard or Yale and so forth. Public universities are, by their very character, their nature, political institutions. Their boards of trustees or regents are generally determined politically, either appointed by a governor or, as in the case of the state of Michigan, elected by the public at large. They view their role as much to make certain that the institution responds to the public as to enhance the fortunes of the institution. In contrast, for a private university, the principal responsibility of the board is the welfare of the institution. There's an old saying for private boards that to be a trustee of a private university, your job is either to give, get, or get off. And so public universities are more complicated because they're surrounded by this political environment, and politics by its nature is reactive. It protects the status quo, it resists change, which makes the leadership of these public institutions during a time of change even more challenging.
And you even have the state legislature and other action groups out there, and which the university is going through the affirmative action suit even as we speak. So there's all these different elements that are out there and that you deal with.
That's correct. That's correct.
Well, and you were implying too that it's quite accurate, as you point out in the book, that it's difficult, if not impossible, to discuss contemporary universities without including the vital role that economics plays in the role of these institutions of higher learning and the constant struggle to provide adequate resources. On the one hand, there's the need to pay for the vast infrastructure required for teaching and research, while on the other hand, there's the constant pressure to keep college tuition affordable for undergraduate and graduate students. And I know you're only too well aware of that, having gone through what you've done.
Well, I think part of the challenge here is that students, parents, the public at large, I think, don't really understand how we pay for higher education in this country. And that, again, is another point of the book, that for public universities, the assumption is that the taxes one pays to the state is returned as appropriation to support those institutions. But in reality, for the University of Michigan, for example, only about 10% of its support comes from state appropriation. The rest of it, that other 90%, which in our case is a budget of about $3 billion a year, we have to raise. We raise it from donors, from students and parents that pay tuition, from the federal government that provides about $500 million a year in terms of support for graduate education and research and so forth. Furthermore, students and parents generally believe that their tuition dollars pay for most of the cost of their education. In reality, once again, in a public university like Michigan, our typical tuition for an undergraduate is about $6,000 a year for a Michigan resident, and the cost of that education is $25,000 to $30,000 a year. So they're probably only paying about 20% of the cost. For private institutions, even larger. Quality higher education is expensive, but it is sustained only by multiple subsidies, usually from hidden sources, not the state through tax dollars and not the student through tuition. And so one of the complex roles of the president is to go out and raise those additional dollars. I really viewed one of my principal roles as president of the university is to generate about $3 billion a year that it took to operate this. And therefore, much of my time was spent in Washington or in the state capitol or with donors or wherever I had to go to find people that would support the institution.
It was quite an effort, and as I observed in your book, you have quite an extraordinary record of fundraising here. Because I think you're showing, just as your comment just now, a keen awareness of the need for large universities to be sensitive to and proficient in the technological dimension of teaching and research. And as you point out, the transformation of the modern university to fulfill its mission, achieve its vision, and move toward its strategic intent depends on several factors, including buying change with additional resources.
That's true. Universities are, they're not traditional command control communication organizations. They're better described as a creative anarchy. In fact, one of my colleagues once time said, leading a university is like rolling a wheelbarrow full of cats. They can jump out in one direction or another if they hit a bump and don't like it. To lead universities, you generally have to seed ideas at the grassroots level so that people believe they're the ones that determine the destiny of the institution and kind of mold and shape that process. So it's not simply a matter of making decisions, it's creating consensus on issues. That causes a real challenge during a time of rapid change, as I suggest in the book, because we can't turn these big institutions on a dime like a corporation could turn, for example. You just can't make decisions and expect things to happen. And that's particularly true for very large and complex and comprehensive universities like the University of Michigan. I think one of the dilemmas we face right now is the scale of time, the scale of change characterizing our time has reduced from century to decades to years and now even months. The old saying, universities change one grave at a time, which reflects the fact that they're really determined by their faculty, suggests the natural time scale for change of the university is decades or perhaps the career of a faculty member. But the rest of society now expects us to change on a time scale of years or even months. And that's a mismatch, and that puts leadership between forces driving rapid change and institutions that want to protect traditions in a very awkward position.
I found your phrase that you used in the book of the university being, the modern university being a knowledge server, which kind of plays on the idea of the computer server, was really quite fascinating. Because it acts, therefore, as a resource that then responds to the different needs in the public and within those resources.
Well, you know, I think that's one of the important messages in the book, because we are going through yet another one of those fundamental transformations in our society. A century ago, it was from an agrarian to an industrial society. Universities played a major role in that through federal efforts like the Land-Grant Act that created the land-grant universities that modernized agriculture, that brought in the technology necessary for industry. Today, we're going through a transition from an industrial society that depends on physical capital or financial capital to a knowledge society that depends on ideas and people, on intellectual capital. And universities, once again, will play a critical role in that because they're the source of educated people and ideas. But this knowledge society, of course, is governed by different kinds of rules. I think the so-called new economy that we're facing with the meltdown we've had in the stock market over the last several weeks is an example of the fact that we really don't understand how this economy works yet. But it's clear that universities will play a very major part in it.
Well, it all has to do with the role of the university in the digital age, and in terms of human interaction, virtual environments, ubiquitous computing, and the need to create, as you say in the book, agents in a knowledge-rich world. I like that phrase too.
Well, the technology itself is driving much of this social transition, and I think that is something that is quite unique to our times. We've had social transformations driven by transportation before, whether it was the telephone or the railroads or the automobiles or whatever. But we've never had a technology, first of all, that involves the very core of what a university is all about, knowledge, how it's created, transferred, stored, and so on. And yet, second, that increases in power at this relentless pace of doubling in power every 18 months, increasing 100-fold every decade, decade after decade after decade. And that's reshaping our society. It's pulling us together as a global village, and it clearly will have a major impact on universities. I think part of the challenge is that we don't yet understand how that's going to affect our core activities, education, research. We see it as a threat, but somehow we have to also transform it into an opportunity so that we protect those important values and traditions that we have, and yet we respond to a rapidly changing world.
I should mention that we're sitting in your office in the Media Union.
That's right.
And that's a major initiative by the university to provide these kinds of resources to deal with the technology.
And we're surrounded by all of these computers.
And I see you have a new, someplace around here, the new G4.
The new G4 laptop,
right,
that's
the very
right.
latest, yeah.
That's right. Well, this facility we're in right now, the Media Union, was one of the last facilities built during my presidency, and it was no one really understood what it was when it was built, but it's kind of a playpen for students. It's a huge facility where students can use technology in their learning. It runs 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and at any point in time, even at 3 in the morning, there'll be thousands of students here. And we're not really sure what they're doing. We hesitate to ask. I mean, they may be sharing Napster files or building companies, but they are learning. And it's to try and look over their shoulders, see how they learn, and see what that tells us about what a university should be.
What kinds of equipment do you have here? I've seen stuff with video. And
almost anything you can imagine. We have obviously thousands of computers, much of it wireless. We have virtual reality suites where you kind of walk in a room and you're surrounded by a virtual environment. We have a sound stage that would put Hollywood to shame. It's a very sophisticated sound stage where we can put on, we've staged opera productions or dance or performance, but we digitally capture what happens rather than having an audience. So the idea is to capture it digitally and then distribute it over the net so that many people can enjoy it. But it's all designed to be kind of a laboratory, a play space where people can see what this technology does. And the term media union is designed to symbolize pulling together the media. I mean, the schools that are involved here are art and music and architecture and engineering and computer science and so forth. And so it's pulling a lot of different disciplines.
Well, one of the interviews we did with the authors of a book called Sparks of Creativity, and the one thing they said in that is play is where you do a lot of learning. That's where you are able to go across ordinary boundaries. It gives you permission to do that.
And that's another great challenge to the contemporary university, because the generation of students that are now entering our institutions learn through play. They learn through collaboration, through creating knowledge, not simply sitting passive in a classroom and listening to someone present the knowledge to them in the form of a lecture. I call them the plug-and-play generation, because I always point out that you can distinguish them, because when you or I sit down on one of these computers and something goes wrong, the first thing we reach for is a manual, and we look up in an index and try and find, the page where it describes it, and we'll waste a couple of hours and give up. And at that point, the best thing to do is call a 15-year-old and say, fix that. And the 15-year-old sits down and begins to do something on the keyboard, and after about 10 or 15 minutes, they fix it.
Right.
And at that point, I usually lean over and I say, okay, now will you show me what you did to this, so if it happens again, I can fix it? And I get this strange look that, well, I'm not sure what I did, but I couldn't tell you if I knew, but if it breaks again, give me a call. That's the
nonlinear learning.
That's the generation we've got to teach.
That's right. We also, before we complete the discussion book, mentioned there's a wide range of topics that you discuss, including service to society, challenges to the research partnership, the changing nature of the academy, the case for diversity, governance and leadership, and then the future of what you call a higher education enterprise. And I know that's we could spend a program in each one of those, but is there, as you observe, a spring of hope for the Society of Learning with all these changes going on?
I think very much. I mean, if you look at the commercial pressures of the marketplace, which are very strong right now in the rest of society, you could develop a great concern higher education may be pushed down the same route that television was pushed down, kind of to a lowest common denominator of quality, kind of storefront kinds of education and so forth. But my own belief is that education has now become so important to societies, to citizens, that we've really got to reach out and provide our citizens with complete opportunities to learn throughout their lifetimes. And so an alternative future I try to place out in front of people in the book is the concept of a society of learning, where learning opportunities of high quality become universal, pervasive, available to people throughout their lives whenever they need it, where people can really are provided with the opportunity to move to the full extent of their abilities and their desires. And that's kind of a Renaissance future for universities and for educators. It certainly couldn't be fulfilled by universities as they currently are formed, but perhaps the university of the 21st century will be one that will evolve into an institution capable of serving a society of learning where, as they say, learning occurs from postnatal to postmortem, from cradle to grave throughout our lives.
And then we must talk about the intercollegiate athletics.
Oh, of course, of course.
Which I'm not sure it's a fun topic, but it certainly is a necessary one to deal with. And we've talked just before the interview about the concern over the commercialization that's going on of the sport and its impact.
This is a book that many of my colleagues as university presidents encouraged me to write. My own staff in the university said, well, you can write it secretly, but don't dare publish it until you leave the presidency. So I guess the concern was the risk to the contemporary university president of speaking out on these issues is so high that it's very difficult to do as an incumbent. But the thesis of the book is that, you know, I'm a college athlete myself. I played football in college and have always been fond of sports, as a spectator and so forth. But I have reached the conclusion that the commercialization of college sports, particularly big-time college football and basketball, has now reached the level where they're doing serious damage to the university. They exploit young student athletes who are brought into institutions primarily to compete and to be a part of a commercial entertainment product with little chance for academic benefit. Graduation rates are less than 50%, and those that get degrees generally get them in meaningless subjects like general studies or recreational sports management or what have you. Clearly, college sports put enormous pressure on university leaders, on governing boards. They distort the finances of the institution. Contrary to what most of the media and most athletic directors would tell you, there's not a college sports program in the country today that actually generates a profit. They all lose money big time. And that comes out of the height of other resources such as faculty salaries, and it's paid for by student tuition and so forth. But most significantly, I think the culture of college sports as a commercial entertainment product is really orthogonal to the values of an academic enterprise. I mean, the commercial enterprise values celebrity status. We pay our coaches millions of dollars. We venerate our outstanding athletes and so forth. The values of a university are learning, reasoned respect for diverse ideas, a variety of other things, the development of human talent, and those are simply not valued by college sports the way we see it today. So I really think we've reached a watershed. And to connect it a little bit with the first book, the theme of the first book is that higher education has entered an era of very profound change where all aspects of the university have to be rethought. How we educate, how we identify and relate to faculty, are things like tenure, do they make sense? And so, well, the contention of the second book is, look, if we're going to evaluate and reassess all of these other functions and characteristics of the university, we should at the same time put college sports on the same table and say, does it make sense for an institution whose principal mission is education, generating knowledge, to build and manage big-time commercial scale entertainment enterprises, primarily for the benefit of the public? And
well, and there's that element, like Murray Sperber talks about, the beer and circus, the spectacle acts. But, you know, is this something that the college university needs to promote? Is you know, all this gigantic you know, production that goes on? Even though I know a lot of people are fond of doing it, one has to wonder.
But you know, it's really interesting because last fall, toward the end of the season, Army and Navy played before a sold-out stadium in Philadelphia. Between the two teams, they had one win. One team had won a game, the other won one game. The game was exciting, decided at the very end. None of the players on the field had any hopes of going into the professions, you know, the professional leagues. They couldn't have even, they wouldn't have been recruited and couldn't have played for a team like Michigan. And yet the game was very exciting. It attracted a television audience, a large crowd in attendance. And so I don't believe that the spectacle depends on professionalizing the sports themselves, the athletes, the coaches. There's no reason in the world why we have to pay a college football coach $1 million a year. Most of these coaches, if you give them a little bit of security, would be happy getting paid not much more than a high school coach would. But to make them a celebrity, you have to pay them that much, and it creates this culture.
Along with all the other television programs and
that's right, and there's this perverse attitude that the team that spends the most wins the most. I mean, a little anecdote that relates to the book. When I was on the board of directors of the Big Ten, we tried to figure out how much college sports really was costing us because we wanted to control costs. And we found out we couldn't get the right numbers from the athletic directors. They wouldn't tell us. And so we got our accountants to come in and go over the books. And we found out that it didn't make any difference whether you were a Michigan or Ohio State that had vast revenues or a Northwestern or Indiana with modest revenues. They all lost money, and they lost money big time once you actually did the accounting in the right way. And so if we're not really making any money off of these commercial enterprises, then they have to have some other reason for existence other than to just entertain the public. If they're not providing students with an opportunity for an education, then what is the purpose? And my concern right now is that we've kind of lost that purpose.
Well, we should point out, though, that it's basically two sports, the basketball and football, that are the ones that really are the spectacle-oriented.
That's true, although that's
field hockey or something's different.
No, but that is beginning to propagate a bit. For example, women's basketball is beginning to rise to a level of visibility, not yet approaching men's, but it's significantly increasing. Other sports like soccer, which are high-interest spectator sports around the world, could ignite and take off.
Well, thank you for appearing on Rip Rap, and like I said, the contemporary university is facing change, and you've mapped out some of the ways that could happen, and certainly you've got the perspective, having done the time, as
That's
they
right.
say.
Well, I think that it was important to write these books while the scars and the wounds were still fairly fresh, and so it has to, but they both have to be looked at from that perspective.
But thank you for being on Rip Rap.
My pleasure.